I still have the dodging tool that he made for Holland Canal, and this was a 16 by 20 print. And he you know, if there was a problem that he had with a print or something, he'd make his own tools like we all do, you know, cut out a dodging tool. And I have it up in my darkroom, and it's huge. It's about this big. Yeah, and it's called Tree. and he would dodge. I think that he would hold back the left-hand side of that print, Holland Canal. You know, get a little more detail in the trees. You know, but it was this massive thing. You know, that he, you know, it's like, how did he do that? Block that much light and still get a nice even print.
It was, I one time saw, Terry, other times I saw 4 Holland Canals that he had printed for somebody to show how they were going to be printed. And each one was different.
Yeah.
I don't know how he did it, because he'd have to work real hard to make each one different, because it would be totally against his nature to do that. I don't really know how he would make 4 completely different prints.
Yeah.
And he just had that kind of a working thing. I always thought he was the most purest and honest photographer that there was in doing stuff. You know, everybody works a lot of stuff, which is good, but just for what he did for his body of work, pretty incredible.
Well, there were only 2 times where I saw him make a photo. Was there when he made a photograph and then saw something that ended up being a keeper, that ended up being, in one instance in the book, and another instance at the big exhibition that was at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art a couple of years ago. I had told this story, but I hadn't seen the print since I saw it at Brett's house a few days later. I showed it maybe a couple of times, but always at the house to like a group of students I would bring by. And I had told this story to my wife, Anna, and then we come up, I said, this is the picture. And so I went and got the curator, Karen Sinsheimer, because there's no photography about it. I said, may I just take a snapshot of this? Because I just want to remember it, because after a while you kind of, did it really happen? And you've had, I think, an almost identical experience, because Brett, I was, again, camping in the driveway, and this was 78, I believe it was, out in Carmel Valley, and he's making dinner. And it was probably wino burgers. And so he would, then there was grease in the pan, and so he puts it in the sink, and he puts some soap suds in it. And so the next morning, I get up at 6 or something. And of course, I know Brett's been up for hours. No matter what time he would show up, I've been up for hours. And so I'm going in to take a shower. And I open the front door, and I head that direction, and I hear this. It's the sound of the mirror locking up on the Rolleiflex SL66. Only it has a distinctive sound. So I follow the sound, and here's Brett by the sliding glass doors out near the pool, and with the pot on the ground with the Rolleif set up. And so he's just working. And I'm, you know, no meter, he's doing 12-second exposures with Agfa-Pan 25. Later that day, he soups the film. You see the negative. He does like a whole roll of this thing. And the next day, what's in the enlarger? That negative. And it looks like the cosmos. And I think you had an almost identical experience.
That's what's so bizarre, because when you tell your story, I go, no, that's my story. But that's what I love about him. He was so consistent in his vision, in what he did. And it's so funny, because I thought, John, I mean, no, that's my story. Because it is exactly, because I used to go out there.
We told it to you. We didn't ever share it with one
another
years ago.
And it was years apart.
Oh, yeah.
Years apart. You know, that he, you know, went out there to wash the dishes, and he said, don't touch that pot. You know, and yeah, that's what I loved about him, was that consistency, no matter what it was. I mean, if it was just in how you, like we joke around coming to the door, you know, get this thing out of here! I don't want it, you know. Every time you came to his house, that's what he would say. So there was this very sort of, I mean, Randy and I would sit out there for breakfast after working, and you know, and he'd always serve us 2 eggs
eggs spread.
Yeah, and he said, well, you know, there's 2 big eggs, you know, and you guys hungry? You want some more? And I'm going, every time.
It was very predictable.
Very predictable, which his artwork was that way in how it was constructed. I mean, how he built his work was, it was so Brett. I mean, you know, you could pick it across the room. Its quality and its vision, it's very few people have that, at least to me in looking at work, have that consistency of vision, consistency of heart, and how he saw this world. You know,
he really always said that he you know, you only compete with yourself, but he said he always plagiarized himself. So there were things he really loved to do, and he would not pass up.
Crack mud, peeling paint.
Yeah, he would always do it with the idea that he was going to do something better than he'd done previously.
Right.
You know, and that was one thing he sort of worked with, the things he really loved. And you could not go past a round object, a tree or a telephone pole or something like that, that he wouldn't stop and attack it. Yeah. And I don't know how he did it. Magnificent stuff sometimes. And you look at it and you go like, whoa. But it was one of the things that he would gravitate to and try and outdo himself.
Right.
And in that way, you know, he would often say that I plagiarized myself.
Mm-hmm. I remember him using those same words. And I think that simplicity, that repetitive quality, I never helped him in the darkroom, as both of you guys did. But I remember one
time. It was very boring.
Well, no, I remember one time he said, you guys could help me squeegee prints. And so he showed us how he squeegeed the prints out in the outside room. And even that, it was like a ballet. There was no wasted effort. You could just tell there had been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of squeegees across. And
it was on that stainless steel tray that was set up on the side, you know, and just like...
With like this windshield wiper.
Yeah, windshield wiper.
And it worked perfectly. And then, you know, he was very cautious at first because he was sure these were not big prints, they were 8x10s, but that we would crimp them. And then he saw that we didn't, that it was okay. But to just watch, everything was so simple throughout Brett's life. And I think if you consider a photographer's work, Brett had a bold signature and he signed it in an unusual place. But the most important signature, I think, and I bet you guys agree, is within those 80 square inches of that 8x10 or that 20x24. That's where you could see Brett's signature before you got close enough to see the pencil on the map.
There's no one, I mean, like I was saying, you could spot his work across the wall, and also just how he printed, you know, and
those middle luscious grays, and the shadow that was a little shadowier than anybody else. Still, you know, part of the composition, not bad, but he just had that, and they make those grays sing.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, you can just spot that. Very seldom do you ever see a Brett, you ever wonder if it, you know, if
no, there was no wonder that it could be printed any other way.
Yeah, the closest thing maybe was the portraits of my father.
Yeah.
Those, you know, that were that kind of thing. But any of his day-to-day work, you know, was just that signature.
Well, more than just about any photographer I can think of, Brett realized that a shadow was often more important than the object that would cast it. I mean, he saw the shadows as part of the building block of the image. Because sometimes photographers that are, you know, getting going, and we all encounter them in one way or another, and they have, the shadows are too dark. And they say, well, Brett's shadows are dark. But the key is, Brett's are built upon that graphic structure. And, you know, looking at
the proportion of where they are and everything.
That's why I love to show students come over to the house the book on his sculpture. Because not only did he recreate the actual photograph, you know, like the bird dude and stuff like that, but in his sculpture, he carved the shadow. You know, and think about that. In three-dimensional, he carved the shadow of a dune. So that tells you exactly how he was thinking, how important, like you were saying, how important that is to the image. You know, and it was all black. I mean, it didn't matter, but to him as an artist, I mean, it was so important, you know, and so revealing to the photograph, that just blackness of the shadow.
Yeah, great stuff. Just, yeah, he was wondrous. It was a lot of fun to work with him because he so enjoyed it. You know, at the end of his life, he just had to do it, but he still had that magic.
Yes.
You know, it still came through. They weren't just, you know, wrote just doing it because it feels good doing it. You know, there was still some importance to it. Just, it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say he was driven from within, and
there's no way
that was contagious.
Yeah, but there's no way I would give up what he gave up to do my work. And you know, I always sort of compare him and I look at him because he was such, to me, such an icon and such someone to live up to. But his austerity in life and what he gave up, personally, I could not do. You know, I could not give up the knickknacks. I could not give up. And he understood that, and we were talking about this earlier. He understood the complexity of my work and what I was doing, and he didn't understand it, but it didn't matter, you know. But yeah, I mean, he was such, I've never, ever met someone like him in my life.
It was the nature of how he had to work, though. In the day books, there's a thing about Edward complaining about Brett being messy and losing stuff and whatever. And at least when I was with him, he kept things really simple because he didn't want a bill. Mm-hmm. He didn't, you know, if somebody sent him a letter, he'd read the letter. He didn't want stuff to conflict with what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And
well, that's what I love.
He kind of laid his,
he
kind of laid what it took him to do his work. So consequently, he'd pay the taxes like 4 times. You know, it's different things, but he didn't want to be bothered with all this stuff. He just did it, didn't want to see it. You know, it was his work, women, cars, you know, he just, it was about the work and keeping things simple enough to do it.
What was the thing where the checks started piling in? There was some workshop that they were, buyers that wanted to do some workshop.
Garrett.
Yeah, some workshop with him. What was
they talked him into doing it, and you know, the checks started piling in all the envelopes, but they made the mistake of sending it to Brett's house. And we called buyers up and got him to come over, and he had this big pile of checks sitting on his table that had been sitting there for a week or whatever, and he said, "I'm not doing it. Get him, send them back." And they should have known better because he didn't want to deal with that.
Right.
He didn't want to deal with the money exchange.
Right.
Partly to his detriment, but you know, but that's what he was. He didn't want to consider all that stuff, you know, and he had no one to take care of it. You know, there was no woman in his life. There was no one that could help him get through that. So he just
kept it simple. Yeah, he, you know, people owed him a lot of money. He wasn't interested as long as he had enough money to keep working.
Yeah, as long as there was, you know fuel
he didn't want to
do
like
anything
wrestle with that or hear about it or anything.
I think in a certain way, he also, in my limited experience, he would go out of his way to avoid conflict in his life. Mm-hmm. You know, he'd just walk away. And you mentioned about openings and things. I can remember here in Carmel when Brett would have openings, whether it was at the Josephus Daniels Gallery, wherever. At his own openings, you'd find him outside 50 feet. You know, he'd be in there for a while. He loved people, but at a certain point, he'd just go outside, and then there'd be a smaller number that would gather around him to talk.
Well, Art's movie really covers him so well.
Art, right, yeah.
I mean, that was such a glimpse to Brett that, you know, us that grew up with him and spent time with him, I mean, that is a gem because it really shows Brett the way he was, you know. I mean, it's a classic if anyone wants to know.
You want to know him. The only thing I always say is that because it's a movie, it's like he's talking all the time. Well, Brett wouldn't talk all the time.
Right.
You know, so it is him, but it's like spliced together, and you just think he talks that much, and that's not really true.
No.
But yeah, you can see the enthusiasm when he's photographing. It really captured him, and his voice and the conversation. I mean, it really
Yeah,
was a great thing.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movie and a very honest portrayal. And I agree with you that because it's compressed, you get the feeling that Brett talks all the time. But when Brett had something to say, it was worth listening to.
Yeah.
And he had a great sense of humor. And he would.
When I first went to Hawaii, he wanted me to come over, and I did, and I'd been with Kim, and I'd been to the little parties and snake bite time and whatever, and it was just like we were talking about. It's the same thing you heard every time, and I'm getting there, and I'm going, oh my God, I'm going to spend a week with talking about the same cliches and everything. We had great conversations about Mexico and whatever. It was like there was a switch in time where he was relaxing, and it was totally different. And not talking all the time, but things would come up in the evening, and after we were done photographing, we'd talk a little bit about Mexico and whatever. And it was really wonderful.
But there were little snippets of it. I mean, he would fall back into this sort of very routine, same sort of thing, snake bite time, this, that, and there were little glimpses throughout his life, and they just happened. I mean, I don't know how they came to be, but he would be very open and sort of honest about, like Randy was saying, his father, even dad, relationships, but there were little, like slivers, little shafts of light that came through. And that's all you ever really saw, the inside of him. I mean, what was going on behind it. Otherwise, it was this very sort of stage, I mean not stage, but just who he was. I mean, this sort of mass, it's like driving by the Girl Scout Center. I mean, how many times did I do that? And him going, the big sign up there saying, Service Center, Girl Scouts Service Center, and he would, I want to get a job there, bud.
I was never a Boy Scout. I was always a Girl Scout.
Right. I mean, it was just,
and I was never good at math, but I had an eye for figures.
Yeah. Right. So you'd hear these sayings again and again, and it sort of endeared you to him because it was sort of, there wasn't any pressure. There wasn't any pressure to come up with conversation or to do anything. You just be. You just be your person. Who you were.
And he was very well read, as you know. He read voraciously, and but with that predictability, you could, in a way, not to take advantage of Brett, you could manipulate it sometimes. For example, you mentioned Diane Nielsen, and Diane was a very, very important person in his life. I had a photography class. I was still living in Southern California at the time, and we made a field trip up here and made an appointment long in advance to go visit Brett around 4-ish.
Right.
So I'd always go down and knock on the door and just make sure everything was good, needed to move some chairs or something. So, then if it was okay, I'd wave the group on down, they'd come in, and Brett would show prints, and it was fascinating. So you'd have some wine, not fine wine, but there was a lot of it. It was quantity, not quality.
Big bottles.
Big jugs, a gallon. And so he'd have in the living room all the chairs set up and things, and so I knock on the door, and Brett said, Big John. So I said, how are you? Diane left this morning. Diane Nielsen had moved out. And I said, well, I'm very sorry to hear that. I met Diane on a number of occasions, and he said, I'm not doing so well. I said, are you up for this? He said, yeah, bring him in. And so, you big guys, you get in the back. You'd have a 4 rows. Dear, right up front, right up front. So this young lady in my class also happens to be named Diane. So every time it would be, we'd get done probably about 6:30 because we started at 4, and Brett would show this remarkable body of work. He'd be very open to answering questions as long as they weren't too technical.
Right.
And as you know, he'd be puffing on his pipe, and every once in a while spew out some ash, take out his bandana, wipe up. It's a vintage print now. And if somebody asked a question about, what was the weather like, or where were you, or something, he would usually answer. If they said, what shutter speed, he would just puff. And then go to the next friend. It was like he turned completely deaf.
Yes.
At the end, I'd always say, we're going to Chong's Cafe in Monterey. Would you like to join us, Brett? We'd love to treat you to dinner. I get up every day, 2 or 3 in the morning.
Right, it was always
and so I said, we're going to Chong's Cafe. Would you like to join us? Because I think Diane is going to be going. Are you going, dear? Yes, let's go.
That's so true.
And I mean, I knew that was the bait. And so that particular class got an entire weekend with Brett. If we weren't at another photographer's home, like your dad's, Garapata, or seeing Ansel or something, Brett would rendezvous with us from Cannery Road to Point Lobos. It was a great experience because he was wooing Diane number 2.
Yeah.
One of our favorite things was Kim and I went out one time, and somebody had just brought a workshop there with some gal, and then Brett showed his prints, and she bought one of his prints. Well, this is the time his prints were like $5,000 if you bought them.
That pocket change.
Yeah, so, I mean, you know, we're going like, okay. And anyway, Brett's got the check right there. He tears it up, and he's going to mail it back to her because he really So Kim and I are going, where are we going to get some women to send out here?
Student discount. Oh, that's great.
There was a certain, he really liked women, but there was a certain chivalry that went with it, and he loved the chase, but kind of in a good way. And I really enjoyed that about him.
Old school way, he would, and they all did, Weston, they would press flowers. So they would get a book or something that they had read, or, you know, and like you said, Brett was so well read. And they would put flowers in the book and then press it and then send it to their girlfriends.
That was one of my jobs in Hawaii, was to, he wasn't really steady on his feet, but I would gather the flowers.
Yeah. I did that for Gina. She liked my pressed flowers. Yeah.
Of course, Gina called him, he was the Golden Prince.
Yeah.
Gina came up with the Prince of Darkness.
I remember the day that. But Brett was sort of, Brett was there, was like, yeah,